Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Managing a Connected Claim Continuum. I'm Beth Weibel, Product Marketing Director here at Cotiviti. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to quickly run through some housekeeping items for today's webinar. First, you can resize all the windows you currently see on your screen, including the slides and presenter video. We have multiple ways for you to reach out to us during the webinar. At the bottom, you'll see our Ask a Question box, which you can use to submit your questions at any point for our speakers. We'll do our best to answer these questions during today's live webinar. I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation rather than wait until the end to ensure that we can get to your questions today. You can use the Email Us button, indicated at the envelope at the bottom of the screen, to send an email to us to request additional follow-up after today's webinar. On the left, you'll find additional resources, including links to useful assets related to the webinar today. And lastly, please take a moment at any point during today's webinar to answer our quick survey. Your feedback is very important to us, and it'll help us determine future topics for our webinars. With that, let me introduce our two speakers. As an Executive Vice President, Matthew Hawley is responsible for the success of Cotiviti's payment integrity operations overall. As our Senior VP of Product Management, Brett Arnold strives to understand client needs and leads the team in evolving client products to meet those needs. All that, and you two are great fun and a pleasure to work with. Brett, with that, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Sounds great. Thank you, Beth. So again, I'm Brett Arnold, and welcome to our webinar on continuing the post-payment to prepayment conversation. So moving payment integrity from post-payment to prepayment isn't a new topic. It's something that most payers have been focusing on for years. The good news is we at Cotiviti are seeing a lot of progress with our clients doing that. We have solutions now that can be implemented both post-payment and prepayment, and we're seeing a lot of success in our client base. So the momentum is very encouraging. Our goal in this session is really to move beyond the theoretical of what could happen and really get focused on real-world lessons learned from our experience. Our session today will be interactive. We're going to have some polling questions for you in just a bit to understand and discuss kind of your progress and challenges. So our goal today is to share insights that we've learned on our journey, successes and barriers to moving upstream, and also sharing lessons learned from our experience with our clients to help you on your journey. Personally, it's been very exciting for me to watch this evolve. It started years ago in talking about what could be, and now we're getting a lot more focused on what is and what's remaining to do. At the end of the day, payment integrity is really about delivering better health care for your members, right? It's really giving more bang for the buck. And prepayment is really another new way to do that, really giving more bang for the buck so that you are more competitive in your markets. In addition, it's also generally viewed as positive from the provider community perspective. Really getting the claims paid correctly the first time improves their experience. So our agenda today has two sections. First, Matthew's going to lead us off with some content, giving some of the background and some numbers from our client base as to progress in this journey. And then I'll facilitate a series of questions on polling questions and kind of see where you are and compare that to some data and results and insights we've received from our client base. All right, Matthew, get us going.
All right, well, thank you, Brett. I appreciate the intro there. So even though I am, I lead our prospective payment area, I still feel that, as do probably all of us on the phone, that retro services are necessary, but not necessarily always sufficient. And that's what we're going to start off talking about. And we're going to try to lay some groundwork around that thought with just some simple statistics here. And in healthcare, we seem to be in some ways behind many other industries in the notion of getting it right the first time. If you look at manufacturing, some 40 years ago, they introduced quality controls, and you see reductions in recalls, and it was about getting those cars and things off the assembly line with quality built in. Software development really fit in behind that 20 or so years ago with the notion of design and testing to deliver software more effectively and correct errors before they were introduced into all of our operating environments. Well, health plans and the health industry is really there now and has been for some time, but have been very comfortable with the retrospective recovery aspect, and while again necessary, it is not sufficient. And there's a trend that we're seeing in moving all of that upstream, a pretty significant trend that is coming to fruition now. And when you look at some of these statistics here in the payment cycle, it's more when dollars are identified retrospectively, we recover less as opposed to preventing more. It takes more time, energy, effort, and therefore money to go get those things and to recover it. And it takes longer to do it, so the time to getting to value is longer. And so the trend, because of all of these things, and you can see the statistics across clients and non-clients here that we see, there's this significant push to take as much of the content or business rules and move them forward as far as possible. And you should be expecting your partner, whoever they are, to do the same on your behalf. So what does a good, balanced payment integrity program look like? That's what we'll talk about next. So this chart has, this diagram here has a lot of numbers on it, so I'm going to spend a moment explaining what you're looking at. Down the left-hand side, you'll see some solution areas in payment policy, coordination of benefits, and DRG validation. And then across the top, you'll see where our analysis in sort of that middle column where it says program potential, where our analysis suggests with the content, known content, we could be in terms of a percentage of where dollars should and could be found. And then on the far right is where most of our clients, kind of in an aggregate, this is no one client, but really an aggregation of all, where they exist on the spectrum. And I'd make a few points around this. Is in the payment policy arena, you can see that the client base with our services is really pretty much largely at the potential. There's some modest areas of opportunity in there, and I'll comment on those. And then in coordination of benefits, while not as effectively moved upstream or in terms of overall percentage of findings, we can't achieve the same level of prepayment opportunities. There's still a significant opportunity to shift for the market. And then finally in DRG validation, again, a little lower in terms of destination of the pause or prepayment, and but a lot of opportunity to get there. So where does Cotiviti, largely see the prospective solutions fitting in terms of the payment cycle? So if this is where a lot of health plans find themselves on the right, and what the perceived potential is, how do we get there, and then also what maybe a little more definition behind the pre, post, and pause, at least how Cotiviti looks at what constitutes a prepayment opportunity, a pause and pay opportunity, and then I think retrospectively or post is pretty clear. So we'll move on to the next slide to talk about that real briefly. So preemptive or avoidance, that's what we call pre. It's not just prepay, but preemptive is, we think of that as anything before the service is rendered by a provider. In the middle, the blue, prospective, is anything between service rendering and payment, and then again, retrospective becomes pretty clear that it's post-payment. So that's the construct in which we're thinking about those prior metrics. And what is most important in enabling content to be moved around? We believe that the winners in the marketplace are going to be those organizations that are most effective at adjusting or sliding in kind of our internal terminology, sliding content up and down this continuum of payment into the most effective and largely proactive places. So a key, some of the key barriers or challenges to that are in the check boxes down below, and what we see in conversations with our client base is that there's often separate teams making decisions around the content. And so aligning decision making, on the other hand, becomes a critical lever in moving content around. Communication with the provider community is also very important. That's often done with different teams and different messaging and slightly different content. And then thirdly, incentive within those separated teams, if in areas that are organized by intervention point, I should add, versus an organization by kind of subject area or subject matter, that competitive incentives can be a barrier. So if I'm running a retrospective shop and my colleague is running all of the prepayment content, we're both handed or develop our goals for the year. And if those are not aligned to be most effective for the health plan versus aligned to me or my colleague, then we, by our virtue of our organization, create a barrier to most effective operation. And so that's these are a set of common barriers that we see, or challenges that must be overcome in every organization, and the key is to align. Whether aligning across separate organizational elements or consolidating those organizational elements so that we can communicate more consistently, we can share decision making, and we can align our goals and incentives accordingly. So when we spent some time talking with our clients about their programs, we talked with them about how they were organized and how they define and measure success, and what they do in the complex environments of payment integrity. And Brett is going to start us down the pathway of sharing with you what we learned from a lot of those conversations. So Brett, back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Matthew. One thing in looking at this picture before we jump to the next slide, I kind of get excited about thinking about how these things fit together. And I know we talked about some of the challenges. I think one of the things is the vision of this can kind of become the heartbeat of payment integrity, where we're inventing new things often retrospectively by evaluating the data. Then we're determining how we can engineer them into a prepayment spot, and then determine, hey, can we predict this, potentially even prevent it from happening? So it becomes kind of how the pathway of, if we can seamlessly integrate it, things get done in moving from postpay to prepay to prevention. So kind of an exciting way to look at it. Okay, so let's jump.
Cycle. Sorry, Brett. You described the virtuous cycle.
The virtuous cycle, yeah, exactly. That's a good word for it. All right, so as Matthew said, we're going to jump to some lessons we've heard from our clients and from the market. And we're also going to start the audience participation program of our webinar. So please help us make this more interesting and valuable for you and your colleagues by responding to this poll. So go ahead, it's a yes/no question. Are incentives within your payment integrity program, are incentives well aligned across your prepayment and post-payment programs? So go ahead and click the yes or the no, and let us know, are incentives well aligned across your prepayment and post-payment programs? So I see some numbers starting, so thank you guys. If you're not yet there, go there and click on that. So as context here, for 20 years, or for more than 20 years, we've been operating both in prepayment with our payment policy management solution and in post-payment with our data mining solutions. And over that time, this incentive alignment has been a significant barrier. When I think way back, it was pretty normal for these to be in two entirely different departments within an organization, not with aligned goals. What ended up happening, it was kind of with the measures, we'd each have a number, and it'd be kind of a I win, you lose sort of a situation to move anything into prepayment. So having, over that time, so having common leadership is a best practice, but probably more importantly, it's having common incentives aligned across prepayment and postpayment that are focusing on removing that barrier. And this means having alignment, as Matthew said, on content and how that gets approved, provider communication, how that gets done, but also on measures of success across pre and post payment, so it becomes that I win, you win kind of win-win situation within the goals. So we have about 20, maybe about a third of people have clicked. So if you haven't clicked yet, go ahead and click yes or no. I'll give you just a few more seconds. All right, we'll jump to the next slide, which is our results. So we have about 40% say yes and about 60% say no. And again, this was your incentives well aligned across prepayment. So for the group on the phone, those that answered, a little under half are well aligned. So I'm going to jump to the next slide and keep talking about this topic because we asked the same question of our client engagement team. So these are the people at Cotiviti that serve our clients directly. And we asked them two questions, really. The first one is the same question we just asked you, which was, are goals well aligned at your clients across pre and post payment? The second question was more about, are the teams actually aligned to be the same team? The results we actually got were encouraging. They're a little bit higher than how you rate yourself on the phone here. About 80% of the time, it seemed like our clients had really well-aligned goals. So that's 65% of the time they actually had the same team, or the processes and team were very well aligned. And another 15 or 16% on the slide had different teams, but they still had very strong alignment of goals. So that to me was very exciting and encouraging. This is way further ahead than it was 15 years ago when we started talking about this. So, and again, it looks like within our client base, a little bit different data point, but in both cases, it sounds like there has been some movement and alignment of goals, but there's still some work left to do. So one note I would say in looking at our clients here and the responses we got is that it's a little more likely that at large national plans that are operating multiple programs, multiple vendors across different geographies and locations, it's more likely that they have a separate team working on payment integrity for prepayment and post-payment. In this case, it looks like they're still doing pretty well about aligning their goals, but they often have a different team. When we start looking at more individual state plans, regional plans, more middle market from our terminology, they are more likely to have a single leader running all of payment integrity with both pre and post payment kind of focus. So anyway, just kind of another tidbit on that. Okay, next question. Let's double click down into this a little bit more. So again, please take a moment to click a yes or no answer on this. The question here is, do you measure the impact of prepay interventions on your post-pay program? So again, another yes, no. Do you measure the impact on your post-pay program when you have an intervention in prepayment? So take a second, if you could, and click yes or no to the best of your knowledge. So for the last 5 or actually more years, Cotiviti has been really actively working on taking our post-payment programs and bringing them into prepayment for a seamless integrated program. And in addition, we've done this with our coordination of benefits. We have a pause and pay and a retrospective integrated program. With our clinical chart validation, or DRG, validation or solution, we have prepayment and post-payment well aligned. But we've also been continually looking at taking our post-payment data mining edits or data mining concepts and implementing them in prepayment. So we've had a lot of experience moving that. And a big challenge that has emerged here is this measurement concept, looking across pre and post-payment. So even when the incentives are aligned at the top, sometimes measures don't line up. So you're trying to figure out, how do I measure a prepayment savings number versus a retrospective recovery number? And more importantly, it seems like there's an emerging need to predict the impact. And where this can really help is in if you're about to move a program into prepayment or a concept into prepayment, understanding what the implication is for your team downstream, so that you can redirect those resources, on purpose, as planned, on time, to deliver value for your members and for your organization. So that kind of predictive nature is important. So so it's kind of important to have both a retrospective ability to measure and a prospective measure, way to measure it, both retrospectively and prospectively. So let's look at our results. Again, thank you, about 30 of you. I really appreciate you guys weighing in here. Let's look at what you said. Do you measure impact of prepay? About 30% of the group said yes, and about 70% says no. So it seems like, similar to the other question, we have a subset of folks that are doing a good job measuring that and trying to predict that, whereas 70% are not. So again, we had a conversation with our client base on this topic. This one was at our client conference this spring. We had a dialogue, and on your screen are some quotes from that I think are indicative of the conversation we had on this front. So the first couple show that while the goals appear well aligned, there's still some challenges in measuring them. You know, different measures, different goals are still out there in some cases. And once you move something to prepayment, it can become taken for granted. That comment on the right kind of says, well, yeah, both teams have the same goals, but once you move it to prepayment, it kind of disappears, and now it's up to both teams to find something new. So it still is kind of a challenge, and it's still almost a disincentive now for both teams instead of just a retrospective team, which I found interesting. So one area here of complexity that we found is in mapping concepts. So when Cotiviti looked to do this and try to measure these implications, it became clear that the edits or the payment policies that our prepayment team were working on didn't have the exact same numbers or naming scheme or identification scheme in our environment as the retrospective concepts. And it wasn't an apple versus an apple. Sometimes the concepts were broader or didn't quite overlap exactly. And so we had to figure out how do we name these things the same thing and categorize them the same, even to really measure retrospectively what the impact is. Another item that's emerging with more complexity is really around cost avoidance here. So we've talked a lot about prepay and postpay here, but when you can move things up into that preemptive intervention that Matthew talked about before, you now have to measure cost avoidance. For interventions like coordination of benefits or our contract compliance things, you're not just intervening on one claim. The intervention is more about the member or a contract change. So for a member, for example, if you find it earlier, now you've fixed the problem with the member and you start paying claims correctly. And so you have payment integrity, but that sometimes is not counted as a retrospective or a prepayment finding. And this is difficult sometimes for our clients to get, I'll call it full credit for what they would have gotten. So if they waited, let the claim get it wrong and then found it, that met their goal. If they were able to avoid the problem altogether, it wasn't measured as well, and again, it just becomes kind of this expected thing, and now they have to go find something new. So that's still, I think, a challenge that we're working on, measuring, moving, not just from post to pre, but from post all the way up to preemptive. All right, so on to question number 3. So once again, would love your help and input here on this topic. Do you include inpatient claims in your automated prepayment editing program? So most, I think, payers have prepayment editors integrated with their claims payment system. Do you include inpatient claims and edits in your automated prepayment editing program? Go ahead and answer. For Cotiviti clients, prepayment data integration is really a key critical enabler for us to move things into prepayment. But it often can be a barrier when we're looking to move things upstream as well. So building a platform that really supports extensibility of what data is included and doing both automated edits and kind of we call it pause and pay, but pause for some human intervention. Building that framework is really critical to moving things upstream. But where it can become a barrier is in, if it's not in there, often it takes engaging R&D or going through security and compliance, and can take months, if maybe not a year, to get things budgeted and executed to move something new upstream. So both a key enabler and a barrier. All right, so we have, I think, a good number of folks responding. So let's see what our results are. This one's great. About almost 60% of folks do have inpatient edits included in their prepayment program. But again, there's also a sizable chunk of folks that are still working on this, about 40%. So again, another kind of somewhat even split with a little more reviewing inpatient claims on prepayment edits. So on this topic, we did an evaluation of our client base. So in the upper left-hand side of the slide here, it shows that when we looked at within our existing client base, about a third, or about 27%, so a quarter or a third, are running the inpatient claims through our prepayment editing solution. So about 75% still have an opportunity to add that in place. Another core capability, I didn't ask you this, but another core capability we have is building the ability to automatically reprice claims. So it's not just that there's a coding or a units or a denial, but being able to look at policies like multiple surgical reductions and things where it's actually kind of a pricing issue. We have a capability we call percentage recommendations, which is really taking a percentage of the allowed amount to fix, I'll call it a pricing area based on those types of things. On that one, we took a look at our client data. It's another data integration opportunity. About 2/3 folks do have that implemented, whereas a third don't. So that's another data point, looking at that prepayment integration and enablers or potential barriers to getting value moved upstream. So looking more broadly, though, inpatient data or the automated integration, these are really what I'd call exclusions. They're things that are really excluded from a prepayment process that create barriers to moving things that are traditionally retrospective into prepayment. And now there are a lot of other exclusions we often see in our client base. So inpatient claims are certainly one thing that's often excluded from an extract. But going beyond that, we often see different funding arrangements. So ASO, large group business, can sometimes be excluded from editing. Different payment methodologies like APGs might be excluded from editing and processes in the outpatient space. There's often contractual exclusions, especially retrospectively, but also prepayment where different health organizations or tax IDs are excluded from a solution, and many others. But those are just examples of exclusions. And so we kind of wanted to analyze this earlier in the year and took a look at and said, look, we have a prepayment payment policy solution. We have a post-payment payment policy solution called our data mining solution. We're saying, why aren't we finding all these things in prepayment? What's the barrier? And we were kind of surprised to find out that when we started analyzing our retrospective data mining findings, 74% of those findings happened on claims that we were not allowed to touch in prepayment. Either they're excluded, like the inpatient claims, or we have a method called a bypass, where the client says, hey, don't edit this claim, but then they ended up falling and getting changed via a retrospective data mining finding. And so that's a pretty big number. So part of this is about Cotiviti being able to evolve our solutions to intervene prepayment, but a big part of it is also kind of on our client side determining how we work on these exclusions. And one other thing I'll note, about half of that 74% from our analysis was inpatient claims, but the other half were still professional and outpatient claims that normally you would have expected to be edited by the existing policy in that realm. So it's not just an inpatient problem. There are still a big amount of exclusions we need to work through for our clients. So stepping back from this, a big part of any program is really looking at these exclusions and having a process in place. And best practice we've seen is a periodic process that's just going through and reviewing all exclusions. An example here that we've seen in our retrospective space is, hey, there's this hospital, we're going through contract negotiations, let's exclude them from all DRG review while we're doing that. And that gets put in the system, and then 3 years later, someone's looking back and saying, why are they excluded? And it's because there wasn't a process in place to make sure that those exclusions are managed on a go-forward basis. So that's kind of a best practice, maybe quarterly, but with some periodicity coming back and looking at those exclusions and saying, hey, are they still appropriate? Are they still what we want? And are they still in the best interest of our members in our program? So in addition, we talked this through with our clients, again, at that same client conference this spring, and said kind of what are some of the challenges you're having with exclusions from your program, and why are they focusing? So again, there's some quotes here that you can read on your screen. There's certainly a focus around provider limits, provider exclusions, contracts, renewal periods. So that was definitely one part, and I think this is more probably in the facility realm than anything else. But timing is a key consideration and theme you'll see here too. Limited by tight payment timelines for certain claims. So again, especially when you get into that inpatient facility realm, do we have enough time to get through it end to end? But the comment on the right is one I want to double click on a minute here. We're challenged by meaningful use requirements. That's one where we see certainly in our prepayment realm where this prepayment integration becomes a barrier to scope. And what happens is often with the best interest, meaningful use is a key part of the security protocol for us and for all of our healthline clients. So not trying to take away from that at all. But as established, if it's done kind of looking at one specific edit or one specific program, we just get the data required for that, and then it's a barrier for all future use, right? So it ends up being, okay, we only start with professional data, now we have to go through a whole program to add outpatient data. Okay, now we have to go through a whole another program and engage R&D or engineering, IT to get inpatient data. Okay, well, we only asked for these columns. So it becomes this process where it really is a stumbling block when kind of adding value to your program. So in talking with our clients, there's a few best practices emerging here that we think could be helpful for you in managing meaningful use. The first one is really to look at the data need at a program, full payment integrity program value, as opposed to just prepay or postpay, or just payment policy, or just COB, or just DRG validation. If we look at the whole program, it becomes more of how do we work with our security? How do we work with our technology problems technology providers, sorry, to establish here's what the overall need is for my program, as opposed to looking at just one slice. Looking at that overall need is very helpful. And one good example of how to do that is look at the data integration model, how data is being passed to either a vendor or passed to a certain part of the organization, and making it much more configurable. So, for example, if you looked at a program and said, hey, we're going to stand up a prepayment data set, we know it needs to be professional, outpatient, and inpatient over time. We're going to start with professional. We know it needs to have all these data elements over time, but here's only the first ones. An integration can be designed where the entirety of the data set is part of the extract, but then there's a business configurable capability that can suppress the certain elements or the certain segments of that data set. So it's designed from the start to send all of the data, but then it's suppressed to meet the meaningful use requirements. And what that allows is a business team, without having to have dependency, or at least a very big dependency in IT, to go back and kind of reconfigure that over time, as opposed to having to go back and building a new extract or doing IT development to build out that extract. So that's kind of one way to look at it more as a program and still meet the letter and the intent of meaningful use. But to do that, that's a little bit more of an investment up front in the process. That's going to be more expensive. But again, that's why you have to look at as a program level, and probably at a more executive level, getting the leadership both in the engineering realm and the IT realm, as well as in the payment integrity realm, to look at this kind of more extensively. And so anyway, that's kind of an emerging trend there around meaningful use that was a good dialogue we had with our clients. So the net of this, exclusions are a big part of payment integrity, and they always will be. So the tricky part is figuring out how best to deal with those. The examples above, both in terms of managing provider exclusions and data exclusions, is really to take a long-term view and stand up a process that's looking at not just what's this first thing I need to do, or what's my immediate need, but really what's the process I need to put in place long-term, and how can I define this so that it's very extensible, and I'm not limiting artificially the value of my program for my members. So thank you guys so much. This is kind of ending the interactive and polling part of our session today. So I really appreciate you weighing in and kind of giving us some data to help this dialogue. At this point, I think I'll turn it over to Beth to see if we got any questions on the content that have come through. Beth?
Thank you, Brett and Matthew, for those great insights, and thanks to our audience for participating in the polls and being good sports. We're now going to begin answering some questions that have been submitted. I see a few in there already. As a reminder, you can still submit through the Q&A pane, and also note our email address on the screen if there's anything that you want to reach out about separately afterwards. So a few things to choose from here. Let's do this one first. Brett and Matthew, what are some examples of things that can't or won't be able to be moved to prepay?
Yeah, so within any program, there are certain things that are unlikely to be moved over time. I'd say that the most glaring example are, I'll call them retroactive events. So in coordination of benefits, sometimes eligibility is retroactively updates. A group doesn't send an update in until 3 months after that eligibility was effective. And so it's just impossible to predict that. So generally speaking, claims may have been being paid during that time period. And so that retroactive event occurs. That can also happen with things like contract updates can sometimes be put into effect. The contract signed on March 1st, but it's effective back to the first of the year. So I'd say one thing is retroactive. Another is really, I'll call it, analysis often happens retrospectively. So for fraud and waste and abuse, obviously there are certain things that you can detect and pause, but looking for a theme of abuse or fraud often has to be done retrospectively, and then interventions can move into prepayment. The last one I would say is focusing on innovation. So again, it's easier to find new things post-pay, and then create them in a prepayment. It often has to be engineered, so it's more of a time frame. But the last thing I guess I'll say, Beth, is that 74% number rings true to me. I shared a couple of slides back, and that's that it's not so much about things that can't be, it's about things that aren't being done in prepayment, right? The data engineering, the claims are being excluded. There's just certain engineering things that are kind of in the way. So we see a lot more happening in retrospective than theoretically could be, but we need it there now as that double check, because just on the average, there are things, it all comes down to a business case, and can you pay to engineer it, and how big is it in order to get there? So it's not what couldn't be, it's often what isn't, if that makes sense.
Brett, I think I might just add one brief comment to what you said there, is that the time to decision making, often driven by the complexity of what is being reviewed, can be a throttle at some point on what can be moved upstream. Though, as a prospective payment integrity person, I kind of lean towards one side of that equation. But the longer it takes to reach a conclusion and the more external data that is relied upon, the more challenges that an organization is going to face moving a piece of review upstream. And oftentimes the thing to think about there is whether or not, and what your legal organization's outlook is on prompt payment. And we've often used the term, can you stop the clock of prompt payment ticking based on the notion of a clean or unclean claim. And therein lies, I think, a big lever in what can be moved. So you want to look for the definition of the clean claim being the trigger for starting the prompt payment clock, and making the case or argument there that the lack of some piece of data or the uncertainty of some information does not keep that clock ticking.
Thank you. This one you both started to touch on a bit, but I don't know if you have anything to add. And that's, why are our clients excluding some things from their prepay program?
Yeah, I think Brett actually covered quite a bit on that. But the one thing that I would add to that, or really maybe it's just stress because he did comment on it, is I call it the vestiges of the past, which is decisions get made around edits or content at some point in time when there's a big project, and then they're set back and they're set aside, and people forget. So I think it's important, very important, to note or record somewhere formally not just what the decision was around, do we edit this or do we pay for that or do we deny or change this, but why the decision was made. And you need to record that at the time of decision making, or it will be a vestige of the past, somebody that's no longer in the organization. Oh, well, that's just the way we've done it. And it can prevent or be a barrier to progress in the payment integrity realm.
great, Matthew. Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick before we move to wrap up. We've been asked, do you have a benchmark you could share for payment integrity activities?
Yeah, so I can start.
Okay, you got it. Okay. Sorry,
sure,
go ahead.
I'll jump in and we can. Yeah, so I've heard for all payment integrity activities across internal vendors, et cetera, numbers in the 10% of medical spend, and that's for the entirety of the program. I don't have the source for that, so please don't quote me. That's what I've heard anecdotally. When we have numbers that we know for our products, so we're part of that overall solution. We augment our clients' payment integrity programs, and in our prepayment that Matthew focuses on primarily with our payment policy and coding validation solutions. On professional and outpatient spend, we're usually saving 2 to 3% of that spend. DRG validation is only on DRG claims, right? But that's in that 3 to 4% range as well on that spend. And looking at coordination of benefits and data mining, those traditional retrospective offerings are a little less than 1%, maybe about 0.8% possible. So that kind of gives a benchmark for kind of the Cotiviti only part of that solution, but recognizing that we're augmenting, the preemptive programs and provider communications and first pass editors and things that are going often upstream of us.
And I would add, Brett, to that just one other point. You hit the things that I was thinking, is that the question I think had some specific reference, but we do see line of business differential, commercial, Medicaid, and Medicare that we can share. I don't have those specifics right at the tip of my tongue for the payment integrity program as a whole, just for the perspective part. But there is a rank order. They're not certainly all the same where we see the greatest level of savings realized. So I think there's whoever asked that question, if you send that in via the email right here, we can get back with you directly on that.
Yep, we can follow up. So thank you. So we don't go over time. Thanks for those great questions. Let's go ahead to a quick wrap up, Matthew. If you could wrap us up in the next few minutes.
Yeah, I think that always got to do things in threes. So leaving you with 3 thoughts. One is if you're organized by intervention point in your payment integrity program, do all of the things, reach out to your colleague across the aisle, so to speak. Those things necessary that we referenced around content approval, around provider communication, around incentives and goals, to bring those 2 programs as close together as possible. If you're already organized then I would make the argument that if you're doing it in a retrospective world, there ought to be great alignment with what you're willing to do in the prospective world. Secondly, is that whether it's internal in your own program or through and with your vendors, is just ensure you are able to slide that content up and down the continuum, because you find different experiences in different locations that can lead to greater success. And then finally, some of the questions that were responded to in this showed a kind of parts of the organization in terms of the participants were further behind in some cases, the clients that we interviewed. But take heart and courage. Nobody's got this answered, and nobody's at the destination. We're all on the journey together, and I think you're in the mix with it. So appreciate your time and attention here today and your questions. And I think those are the final thoughts I have. Brett, anything that you would add to that in closing?
No, thank you very much, Matthew. Just thank you all for your time. And again, remember, where we were and where we've come. I still personally have a lot of excitement of seeing how we've evolved, but there's a lot of room to go. So thank you for your time, and excited to talk with you today.
Great, very good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes our webinar for today. Many thanks to our speakers and to our audience for your great participation. That makes it so much more fun. We'll be reaching out to you via email shortly with a link to an on-demand recording of the webinar. Please don't forget to take a moment to answer our survey about your experience to help us keep improving. Thanks a lot and have a great afternoon.